So I've been seeing a lot of people talk about what's happening right now currently in Chicago. And there's a bit of confusion, and also people are explaining, but not necessarily going into what it is that's actually happening and how this all relates. So Chicago, Oregon, Memphis, DC. In this video, we're going to slow down and look at what's actually in motion. And then, I'll speculate a little because a large part of this is on the assumption of patterns and not necessarily what's being stated or what is being said. What's happening in Chicago is not random. It's part of a pattern, and it started months ago right here in Memphis. And the reason why we need to understand this is because it could set a national precedent for how far federal power can reach inside state borders. So back in July, the White House issued an order called the Memphis Safe Task Force under Title 32 of the U.S. Code. You can read it for yourself. Now, Title 32 basically means that the National Guard operates under state command and gets federal pay, which is a technical loophole that allows the federal coordination without officially declaring martial law, but it is blurry because right now that very thing is being challenged in federal court between Oregon and the White House. So the idea is that the order itself to send troops into Oregon underneath Title 32 is too vague. Oregon is not in need of federal forces, according to Oregon's governor, and they're fighting. But we'll talk about that later. This is a technical loophole that allows federal coordination without officially declaring martial law. That's important. Now, the order itself doesn't just mention violent crime. It goes further, listing things like trespassing, vagrancy, noise, graffiti, and unpermitted demonstrations. That's why we see in certain places like, say, Chicago, where protests are happening because it's a state that opposes federal forces being within its borders. So right there, we see within this order that it wasn't just about safety. It was about setting a structure that could criminalize broad behaviors under the label of law and order. And that framework, which is currently existing in Memphis, became the blueprint for what's happening now. So while all of that was unfolding here in Memphis, the same model quietly started spreading elsewhere. By August, coordination had already started between the White House, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice. By early September, Chicago was named the next priority city. And almost immediately after that, Oregon appeared on internal lists as well. Now, the key difference is that Memphis had a public memorandum while Chicago and Oregon didn't. They were activated through internal DOJ orders. Not public documents, but court filings show that they were modeled after the exact same Memphis order. So city by city, the playbook stays the same and the names just change. In early October, federal agents, including ICE, Homeland Security, and the U.S. Marshals, entered a Chicago apartment complex in what they called a joint operation. Residents say the building was raided without warning. Adults and children were zip-tied. Apartments were torn apart. Some people say they were detained without warrants. And this is not speculation. This is documented in local outlets. Shortly after that, Illinois attorney Kwame Raoul announced a lawsuit against the federal government, arguing that these deployments violate both the Constitution and state sovereignty. But a White House spokesperson told reporters that operations would continue as planned. So now Chicago's lawsuit is testing one central question. Can the president use federalized forces inside a state that did not consent, regardless of that state's constitution or the U.S. Constitution? Now, Oregon faced the same situation, but they moved much faster. When the president tried to federalize Oregon's National Guard under Title 10 of the U.S. State Code, the governor said no and took it to court immediately. Title 10 is different from Title 32. It means full federal control, no state command, which is different from what is currently happening in Memphis. And under the Posse Comitatus Act, the military cannot perform domestic law enforcement duties. A federal judge ruled in Oregon's favor, saying the president's move violated the Posse Comitatus Act. That ruling sets a legal line. It's proof that state governors can still block federal overreach, but only if they're willing to stand up for it. And this is also only if the president is willing to allow that to happen, because there has been much talk about whether or not the president would still send federal forces into a state or a city without federal approval. More on that in another video. Now, remember that in Tennessee, Governor Bill Lee originally said no to the Memphis deployment. Months later, he reversed course after what he called months of conversation with the federal government. Now, there's no public record showing what these conversations were, but that kind of reversal tells us that some states might not be giving genuine consent. They may be saying yes under political pressure, not necessarily public interest. So Tennessee is showing compliance, Chicago shows resistance, and Oregon shows what happens when a state fights back in court. So now we're going to talk about the legal basis. We're going to better understand it so that we can be clear, or as clear as we can be for the purposes of this video, because a lot of what's happening right now has never happened. So Title 32 means that the governor is in charge and the state is in command. The feds take care of the bill. That's what's happening in Memphis. Title 10, president is in charge, and that means full federal control. And the Posse Comitatus Act is written into our Constitution and restricts the military from acting as police. Now, I mentioned in another video, but Juliette Kayyem, a former Homeland Security official, went on PBS warning that these undefined multi-agency missions create scope creep, meaning once federal power expands into local spaces, it rarely retracts. And we've seen mention of that in Tennessee, where our governor is clearly communicating these federal forces are not leaving anytime soon. Now, reports are surfacing that the president and his advisors are considering invoking the Insurrection Act, which would allow deployment of the military without state consent. That's something we have only seen a few times in U.S. history, usually during national crises. If that happens, Chicago could become the legal test case for whether states still have authority over their own policing. Now, this matters not just for Chicago, but for the entire America. This pattern from Memphis to Chicago to Oregon is not about crime. It's about control, executive overreach. It's about testing how far the executive branch can go without resistance. It's about seeing which state leaders are willing to commit treason or dishonor the Constitution in lieu of saying yes to our executive branch. And depending on how these lawsuits play out, it could permanently shift who has authority over your city's police, your state's guard, and your constitutional rights, at least for now. So if you live in one of these cities, start paying attention to your governor's statements, the legal filings in your state, and what federal orders are being activated quietly in your area. Because once federal power moves in, history shows it rarely leaves. And next time we're going to talk about a word that quietly slipped out during a live press conference recently, which is plenary. And that word explains everything about what's coming next. It's going to be especially interesting to see what happens when judges rule in favor of the cities that are suing. It's going to be our turn to kind of watch and see what the president does. Does he follow the order, or does he move into these spaces anyways, citing that he has the power to do so because he's the president? So let me know in the comments. What do you think? Do you agree? Do you have something to add? Did I get something wrong?